Hi, folks. I'm just doing a short read aloud today. I'm in the process of trying to put together sort of an analysis of a recent write up slash interview about RFQ Jr. And a part of it, the thing that I want to talk about is nuclear power. And so I was going back through the Oliver Reiser's Cosmic Humanism. And this is a much thicker book. I only got to page 85 last summer before I gave up. It's a lot of higher level physics. This is a lot trickier than world sensorium. But I was talking to Jason earlier, and I was talking about radio eugenics, and I sort of feel like that's what's coming with this idea of radiation hormesis and guided evolution. And so Jason was like, tell me again about radio eugenics. And I was trying to sort of riff off of that a little bit. But I thought, you know what, let me go ahead and just look it up. And it turns out it's towards the end of the book. It's like on page 522 or something like that. And I was busy taking pictures with my phone, and I was going to put it in the map. And then I thought, it's probably better just for everyone if I just go ahead and read it. And then everyone will have it if anybody wants to listen. So I'm just going to do a read aloud again from Cosmic Humanism. This is from 1966, although a lot of the material is earlier from like the 1930s, and sort of lay out the radio eugenics part, at least the section that I could find in here. Okay, so page 522 of Cosmic Humanism by Oliver Reiser. Does man need a new brain? One scientist who believes in the possibility of further mental evolution for man is Dr. Frederick Tilney. In his volume, Brain Evolution from Mammal to Man, Dr. Tilney observes that even though it is true that at the present time we make use of but a fraction of our present brain, nevertheless, the brain of modern man is not a finished product. It seems likely to this student that the present brain requires an intermediate stage in its ongoing development. He asks, is there still a latent power in the human brain for the expression of an as yet unsuspected potentiality and beneficial progress? This question is answered in the affirmative by other theorists who have surmised that these unsuspected potentialities will turn out to be psychic powers, such as those who have the gifts of telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. Along these lines and others, the speculations and predictions accumulate. For the sake of the argument, let us admit the possibility that man will attain conscious control of his own future evolution. Does this require that modern knowledge from the science of genetics concerning the experimental induction of mutations offers the only realistic program for a creative control of man's development? In that event, man-made humans is the next terrifying responsibility that man will take upon himself. This obviously is eugenics, but eugenics carried to the nth degree. Okay, and this is important because part of the stuff I'm going to talk about when I do my analysis is centered on eugenics, but the individuals involved were framing eugenics as sort of a death cult and not an optimization cult. And I think the optimization piece is really important because I think that's where they're taking us. Section 5, gene mutation and guided evolution. The coming achievements in the field of guided evolution seem not far away, especially when one surveys the new knowledge of genetics concerning the DNA molecular code, which contains the master plan for building the living organism. The discovery of the double spiral of nucleic acid as a blueprint, which determines the traits of the resulting organism, whether it is to be a Mozart or a moron, a man or a mouse, is a revolution far greater in its potential significance than the invention of the atomic bomb, according to one scientist. And again, I think it's really important to know that the Human Genome Project came out of essentially the study of genetic damage from the atomic bomb blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That conference in the 80s at Alta Ski Resort outside of Salt Lake City, that was initiated based on the study, the research of the genetic damage from the atomic bomb. And then that's what led to the Human Genome Project, also managed by Los Alamos. The possibilities of revolutionary developments woven into the double helix structure of the DNA molecule, as pictured in the now famous Watson-Crick model, lead one to predict the following developments. 1, the creation of living matter in the laboratory, thus explaining at long last the mystery of the nature of life. We haven't figured that out yet. The elimination of virus diseases, including some types of cancer. 3, the conquering of old age and senility. 4, the creation of superior types of human beings, the coming supermen of controlled biological evolution. And that's the optimization part. The true nature of the problem and its dimensions are now before us. We see that the possibilities are immense. It is generally known that many illnesses peculiar to man, and usually termed psychosomatic, are a consequence of the prodigious development of the cerebral cortex. While the older part of the human nervous system, the brainstem, including the diencephalon, has remained at a stage suited to the earliest age when our pre-human ancestors descended from trees. During the past 10,000 years, man's environment has changed enormously, with more changes still to come. The cortical censorship of the ego over the id, to use Freudian terminology, sets up an imbalance, and thus this now requires some readjustment. The proper balance between the old and lower brain and the new and higher brain could prevent some mental illness which man has brought upon himself, namely wars, crime, inner conflict, and insanity. Techniques for the attainment of more harmonious relations in the interest of human happiness and social sanity have long been available to the yoga practices of the Hindu and Buddhist disciplines. But for Western man, this seems not to have offered a way out for his entrapments. Perhaps a new way must be explored for our world. Quite characteristically, Western science is now experimenting with the chemical approach to the control of biological heredity and mental endowment. The term now being used to designate the new technique for the control of hereditary traits is, quote, genetic surgery. This means deliberately adding, subtracting, or changing the genes in the chromosomes. A notable advance in this area was made by Dr. Muriel Roger at the Rockefeller Institute, who reported on the procedure for the fragmentation of hereditary material into individual genes that determine specific characteristics. In other words, plucking these genes out and inserting them into other cells, and thus giving these latter cells new traits. This technique is still in its early stages, of course, but it promises ultimately to confer upon man the ability to alter in predetermined ways the inherited traits of living organisms. In the light of these awesome potentialities for good and evil, well might be the Nobel Prize winner Arne Tiselius warn his fellow humans that this knowledge can lead to methods of tampering with life, of creating new diseases, of controlling minds or influencing heredity. This, to be sure, is the negative side. It is an old story. Scientific discoveries have possibilities for baneful as well as beneficial applications. We see in all of this an enormous increase in the need for and responsibility of humanistic ethics for mankind, a planetary morality for the coming world civilization. In connection with these weighty and urgent matters, we have the volume Mankind Evolving by Theodosius Dobzhansky. Here is another scientist, a distinguished biologist, who is certain that man is not a finished product. His views in the field may be condensed into the following theses. Evolution is change. Mankind has evolved. Mankind is still evolving. If mankind survives, it will continue to evolve. It is interesting to note that Dr. Dobzhansky believes that man as a species is perhaps evolving more rapidly than other species. The natural rate of mutation is on the increase, so says the geneticist. As we know, some parts of this mutation rate is due to the increased radiation dosage, parentheses fallout, produced by nuclear testing. Yeah, and that's probably on purpose. Well might Linus Pauling and the rest of us strain our efforts to secure a nuclear test ban treaty that extends to all nations. When we recall that most human mutations are harmful in their effects, it appears that the production of human mutations through radioactive exposure alone is not the right way in which to achieve new humanity of the future. Another scientist who is concerned with the improvement of the human stock is Dr. Herman J. Muller. In his address at the University of Chicago celebration in 1959, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, appearing in Evolution After Darwin, Volume 2, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist dealt with the biological decadence which is encouraged by modern society. The provocative thesis of his address, The Guidance of Human Evolution, is that man needs a social awareness in matters of human reproduction, a recognition of his responsibility for the genetic endowment of future generations. According to Dr. Muller, allowing detrimental mutant genes in the human population to accumulate to a higher frequency will result in deterioration, and to counteract this, we require a new morality which permits artificial insemination and thus the use of banks of deep frozen cells so that many can make use of the genetic endowments of the Einsteins, Beethovens, Da Vinci's, Lincolns, and other geniuses of the race. To achieve this, Professor Muller argues some long-established rights to one's own germinal material will have to yield. Of course, the problem of what kinds of man-made human belongs in our society is to breed Of course, the problem of what kinds of man-made human beings our society is to breed brings us face to face with a whole nest of ethical considerations. The next great problem in ethics may be this: who controls whom, for what purpose, and by whose consent? Various aspects of this many-sided issue must be faced up to if man is to survive and live in a more perfect society. Section 6. Man's new image of man. In this fashion, we come to what is the supreme problem of modern man. What new image of man shall man make of himself to provide the model and morphogenetic forces for the world that is to be? Human evolution, we know, can occur on 3 levels: physical, mental, and moral. So far as neuroanatomy can discern, there has been little change in the human brain for tens of thousands of years. But on a geological timescale, this is but a tick of the cosmic clock. This, however, does not rule out the possibility of cerebral changes in the future. And for that matter, in the brain as now constitutive, there may even be some silent areas yet to be heard from, so to speak. And once these sleeping areas are awakened, the creature of tomorrow may be upon us. The most significant fact in all our accumulation of knowledge in the behavioral sciences is the discovery of the developmental capabilities of man, the unfoldment of new forms of consciousness. Julian Huxley, one of the wisest of our scientists, concedes that man's physical evolution is in abeyance, so that for Huxley, man's future evolution is mental social. The tides of evolutionary energy will flow through man's psychosocial unfoldment. But even if Huxley is proven wrong and new biological structures are forthcoming in the man-to-be, it still is true that we can develop new states of consciousness and original forms of conduct. What is needed is the kind of expansion of consciousness which has been studied and reported by Maurice Bucke in his classic work, Cosmic Consciousness. This type of awareness has also been discussed by William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience and by Walter Stace in his book, Mysticism and Philosophy. All students agree on the presence of certain characteristics in this type of experience, those indeed that are manifest in the mental effects resulting from the use of psychedelic drugs. These include the ecstatic sense of union with an all-inclusive and undifferentiated reality, the beatific experience of a timeless bliss, a peace that passeth understanding, the satori of Zen Buddhism, the samadhi id Vedanta, one's contact in the depths of the psyche with the germinal higher part of himself, as James put it, and the peak experience of Maslow. These all resemble the cosmic consciousness of Bucke. The developments we have projected have been associated with the advent of non-Aristotelian orientation. This next development of man was and is based on the fact that on the higher levels of synthesis, the dualities of psychological fragmentation disappear and no longer control one's attitudes. The total individual apprehends things in their own universal relationships, even on a more familiar level. Insight, humor, love, and the rest have a universal character when they are depersonalized and desexed. Perhaps the restoration of the unity of personality which Plato pictured in the myth of the separation of the sexes is what the poet William Blake had in mind in his conception of the resynthesis of human nature, and which Northrop Frye described by the term fearful symmetry. The evils of the fall of man are then finally undone, and then man returns on a higher level of development to that psychological Garden of Eden, which we have variously designated as designated as the head-heart synthesis or the cortico-thalamic integration. This sets a worthy goal for man. In the production of such a higher unity, each person would help shape the world into the forms of peace and happiness. Subjective planning and objective planning would converge and coalesce. Obviously, our image of archetypal man, the avatar of synthesis, is quite different from the Superman of Nietzsche. The German philosopher's Übermensch was a tough, masculine creature, free from what he regarded as the effeminate traits of pity and sympathy. Our own conception of the world citizen of the new society would combine traits that are masculine and feminine within the same individual, not necessarily in the form of bisexualism, but more along the lines of the androgynous type of personality. We find such persons in highly developed men who acquire the qualities of what Nietzsche regarded as feminine, and in advanced women who have what men flatteringly termed masculine intellect. This is the kind of development that makes possible friendship among creative people who find common grounds of understanding that transcends ordinary sex relationships. This new humanity, which we envision, is no product of a vulgar and dangerous tampering with the trend of biological evolution. It will represent a reverent experience in alchemy, the bringing into being of the heavenly man of cosmic mythology. This hypothesis would agree with the interpretation of human evolution as presented by Teilhard de Chardin, who sees the process of evolution as leading to the ultimate Christification of the universe. While the language employed here is not of my own choosing, the thought expressed is that of St. Paul's concept of the cosmic Christ as providing the clue to the meaning of the universe, the realization of the latent presence of Christ not only in human beings, but in the very structure of matter. But is this not only the pantheism of Giordano Bruno and Spinoza and Emerson? This theme, in its various guises, is no stranger with the motifs of our form of scientific humanism. These ideas were advanced in my previous book, Nature, Man, and God, 1951. To go no further back, the course of subsequent development has not altered the argument. Since this volume is now out of print, I am here reproducing the last half of chapter 9 of the book titled Humanism's Great Experiment. The story of this proposed, quote, experiment needs to be retold because it completes the picture as it outlined in the present volume. With nothing added, I begin with section 4 of that book. Section 7, Man, Avatar or Atavist. The object of this planetary experiment is to raise humanity to a new level of consciousness and bring about the synthesis of the introvert-extrovert, east-west, types of mankind discussed in previous chapters. Perhaps some of my readers have read the article in Life, March 3rd, 1947, on psychosurgery, a report on the operation which involves severing the prefrontal lobe, supposedly the seat of the superego, from the thalamus, supposedly the seat of emotion, the id of the Freudians, in order to relieve insane patients of emotional tensions which produce psychoneurotic perversions. As the reader will recall from our table of orientations, my own theory of corticothalamic synthesis is based on the idea that level 3, the non-Aristotelian level of a coming world culture, will reinstate on a higher level something similar to Levi-Bruhl's mystical participation of primitive people. Psychosurgery seems to me to be a device for transporting a person mentally from the second level to the level of primitives, thus freeing a person from the abstractions of cortical symbolism, which he is unable to handle in a socially acceptable manner. The criticism to be made of this psychosurgery type of solution is that it involves a form of atavism and is not using conflict and tension as a creative force. It virtually renounces the possibility of a creative self-evolution. What we need are avatars of synthesis, supermen, not atavists of evolution, subhumans. Instead of reverting to an earlier level by discouraging the higher level of encephalon from the old brain, why not evoke a new structure to be added as the basis for a still higher level of integration to provide what we call the head and heart synthesis? That, thoughtful reader, is the objective of this great planetary experiment. The essence of the theory, first proposed in a tentative manner in 1937, was based on one, using atomic energy, radiation, to initiate the genetic or chromosome change which causes mutations. And two, doing this under the guidance of a psychosocial field to control the course of the biological changes so that the form of emergence is determined. Okay, so I'm going to just read that over again because that's the radio eugenics part. The essence of the theory, first proposed in a tentative manner in 1937, okay, so before the atomic bombs, was based on one, using atomic energy or radiation to initiate the genetic or chromosome changes which causes mutations, and two, doing this under the guidance of a psychosocial field to control the course of the biological changes so that the form of emergence is determined. So I would just say this is important. This is really important. I mean, I'm just reading this now. You know, I've had a general awareness of it, but we need to revisit the Cold War. And actually, that's part of what I'm going to be talking about a little bit, because the framing of this particular interview was very much that the one person is pushing the Belt and Road sort of bricks alignment. And what Reiser is about is bringing this all together, East and West, into this planetary humanism. And so I keep saying, I think we've misunderstood what the Cold War was about. We were told an incomplete story, and that through the Pugwash conferences, these scientists were getting together behind the scenes for all of those decades. And the nuclear testing that took place was very likely part of this kind of program, right? To install the radiation for the mutations and to do that level of study. And then if you think about the weaponization of the atmosphere, the space fence, right, that's being developed within morphogenesis and sort of guiding field theory, it sort of feels like that's the combination of the radiation and then the force field in space, the ionosphere, you know, which Alana talks about a lot. You know, the Cold War allowed the space fence to be put into place under the guise of we needed it to, you know, to prevent, you know, nuclear missiles from landing on us, and that we all needed to have that weaponized. So, and, you know, and it continues now with Starlink and Musk and everything else. But yeah, so very interesting. 1937, they were already talking about that. This means, if my theory is correct, that the psychosocially visualized form of the new humanity would act as a morphogenetic field or matrix, and man's idealized image of man would function as an archetype to create or give form to the new humanity. This, if achieved, would be one true instance of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Here, Russian science would be right, because man literally thinks a new structure into existence. If such a remarkable result were forthcoming, the creation of a world brain and a world heart would bring all of history to a sublime climax. These social organs for a planetary way of life would transform the earth into one psychosomatic organism. What, you ask again, is the purpose of this planetary experiment? And we reply, the purpose is the proliferation of a hitherto unknown function of the mind, different from the logical function, which would establish the type of oneness we have repeatedly described as the corticothalamic synthesis, but on a new level of integration. And I think that's the integral theory. This would be level 3 of our table of orientations. We have long urged that the understanding of the universe is something more than intellectual analysis. It also involves the sort of feeling with, which Bergson terms intuition, except that we call it insight, and we do not set it in opposition to intellect, but we regard it as intellect raised to the higher level of scientific mysticism. And so, yeah, so that's that is bringing together, you know, that is the East and West and the unification. And yeah, like if everybody joins in the Belt and Road, that would be the world brain, right? That would be it, especially with some sort of like decentralized, you know, modular nuclear blockchain grids and digital identity. Wow. Okay. but we'll just call it scientific mysticism. Okay, section 8, the role of planetary polarity. Let us suppose that all human beings were to turn toward north and try to visualize some sort of streamlines, mental isotherms, as it were, giving our thoughts wings as if they were birds flying towards the Earth's magnetic pole. If this concentration of energy on a collective image were synchronized by a central clock through signals sent out by radio, could we thus produce a new emergent time axis with transposable properties, values, and ideology across a social whole? Would the macroscopic field thus produced exert an influence on the chromosomes to create within the individuals an organic hookup or resonance and give birth to the head and heart synthesis? If such a biosocial experiment were possible, how would the individuals participate as parts or cells within the emerging superorganism, which is the planetary being? And would the culmination of the mutation yield the sort of illumination which R.M. Buck described as cosmic consciousness? If we answer these questions in the affirmative, this means that on the social level, we are seemingly subscribing to a form of Lamarckian doctrine of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Man would apparently develop the organs of Superman because he wanted to be something more than what man is today. But before classifying ourselves in this manner, let us get to all the possibilities before us. Section 9, Darwinian versus Lamarckian evolution. In the main, there have been two types of evolutionary theory available as follows. A, evolution by Lamarckian factors, the influence of desires or needs, and the inherited effects of use and disuse. B, evolution by Darwinian factors, heredity, variation, struggle for existence, and survival of the fittest. The argument between the present followers of Darwin, the neo-Darwinians, and the followers of Lamarck, the neo-Lamarckians, is something more than an academic issue. Not only the question of the method of past evolution, but the problem of future improvement of the human stock hinges on the outcome. The hereditarians or neo-Darwinians deny that the strivings of individual men have an influence on the genetic determiners which are responsible for structures and traits, whereas the environmentalists, the neo-Lamarckians, believe that modifications due to individual efforts to use and improve the structures of the body will produce changes that will be structuralized in the organs of new generations of animals. Our own theory of self-evolution through conscious striving would seem to favor the Lamarckian theory, except that in the past I have never asserted that such efforts would have any direct biological influences. Even now, when I suggest an experiment in mental control of biological mutation, I might, if I wished, escape the implication of the inheritance of individually acquired traits. I have in mind here the third possible theory, which was explained in The Promise of Scientific Humanism, 1940, page 201, under the term hypothesis of parallel induction. This idea, neither pure Darwinian nor Lamarckian theory, admits the possibility of the appearance in subsequent generations of structural modifications that apparently are the result of function and experience in the organism, the effect of desire and use in Lamarck's terminology, but in fact are the result of changes that occurred simultaneously in the somatic and germ cells without there being any causal interaction between bodily behavior and genetic units. Actually, however, as previously indicated, I am willing to overlook the objection to Lamarckian theory on the human level. It may be that the inheritance of acquired characteristics is a fact on the human level, while not a fact on the levels of subhuman evolution. The Soviet Lysenko argument to the contrary notwithstanding. Because men can have clear mental pictures of what they desire, while imagery in animals, whether motor or visual, is virtually non-existent. In taking up this problem of producing the new humanity, we are not suddenly cultivating an interest in a subject which previously was not the focus of our attention. This problem for me is an old theme, and the present views are merely an extension of ideas previously advanced. But before taking up these recent developments, it is well to recapitulate our journey up to this point. Roughly, therefore, I am following the temporal order in which these thoughts emerged in my own mind. The topic is so complex that this seems to be the best way I can give coherence to ideas which are gradually being worked out. 10. Radio mutations and man. So there you go. In an article on Cosmoecology, A Theory of Evolution, Journal of Heredity, November 1937, I proposed a theory of radio mutations based on the ability of rays of short wavelength, gamma rays, cosmic rays, to produce changes in the genes and thus cause biological mutations. It was there suggested that cosmic ray showers have a periodicity, and that, as in the ion blanket above the Earth raises and lowers for reasons having to do with the sun as the pacemaker of biological evolution here on the Earth, the creatures on Earth are irradiated. It was there stated, quote, indeed, the recent work of Carl D. Anderson and Seth H. Niedermeyer on the top of Pikes Peak indicates that cosmic rays are capable of smashing up atoms and molecules and liberating highly penetrating neutrons. Why then shouldn't cosmic rays, or better still, the secondary radiations in the form of high energy particles released by cosmic rays, be able to reach the genes and bring about nuclear changes in the organisms no less effectively than in the hearts of atoms? A further implication of this theory was pointed out in the last paragraph of the above journal article as follows, quote, one interesting implication of the present theory is that evolution is not yet done with the human organism. If it is true that biologically and mentally man is still in process and new traits yet remain to appear, one may well wonder what the future Superman will be like. Interestingly enough, our own hypothesis throws some light on the possible time of advent of a new species of humanity. Our yardstick for measuring the tempo of evolutionary advance suggests that humanity is still in its infancy and that we will have to wait a long time before the manhood of humanity is reached. Apparently, man must remain content for a long time to come before any radically new changes take place, unless, through radio eugenics, we take the fate of biological evolution into our own hands. And in that case, we may find it feasible to create or remake human nature to suit the requirements of our own social architects. If this view is correct, the induction of mutations and their selective utilization may offer our one true hope for a genuinely creative control of conscious evolution. But how can evolution be artificially speeded up so that man will be kept ahead of the evolutionary parade? In the further elaboration of this article in the corresponding chapter of The Promise of Scientific Humanism, 1940, chapter 21, these lines were added to the reproduction of the journal article. Quote, but how can evolution be speeded up? Since at the present time, man does not know how to control the ionosphere and elevate and depress it to suit his will. That's interesting because now we're controlling the ionosphere, right? But how can evolution be speeded up? Since at the present time, man does not know how to control the ionosphere and elevate and depress it to suit his will. The increase in the number of cosmic ray collisions with the genetic units to produce the radical mutations necessary to the creation of a race of supermen can come only through rearing a race of humans on the highest mountaintops, where the cosmic rays and showers are relatively numerous and plentiful. Of course, it is possible that men will eventually learn how to produce in his scientific laboratories the wonders of heaven, and in that case, his cosmic rays can be made to order. Man's strategy has always been to learn from nature and then go nature one better. Now, today, since the mastery of the science of nuclear fission and fusion, man does know how to release and utilize the neutrons referred to in our 1937 article. So that instead of going to mountaintops to create, quote, the new humanity, we could, if we wished, subject human fetuses to irradiation by the byproducts of atomic fission and fusion. But we know that the byproducts of atomic disintegration can be very harmful. The study of the biological effects of the atomic explosions in Japan indicate that the radioactivity that's thus produced can cause sterilization and death in those exposed, and possible malformations in subsequent generations of those born to the generation that lived through the baptism of fire to reproduce themselves. But we also know, on the other hand, that nature always has in the past exacted a high price for biological quote unquote progress, which means that for every mutation, there is a beneficial, many more mutations are harmful. But it is possible that the same ratio would be maintained on the human level. But we underline the possible. Perhaps the beneficial use of atomic energy outside its uses in medicine is a matter of selecting the right types and dosages, frequency, and duration of irradiation, plus the controlling influence of a mental guiding field. This latter would be a kind of psychokinetic effect on the level of biological causation. And, I think that's kind of interesting to sort of think about this idea of, personalized medicine, right? That's kind of where things are going with the personalized medicine. And, we go back to the book, This Perfect Day, where they were getting monthly chemotherapy treatments to be run by Unicomp, the computer. And that's my concern with this modular nuclear is that, in some ways, I was going back to look at the clip from the Mormon Transhumanist Conference. And, if I'd seen the presentation and it wasn't at the Mormon Transhumanist Conference on blockchain, I wouldn't have been so concerned. I would think maybe it's a little more interesting. But these modular nuclear installments are to make radioactive isotopes ostensibly for cancer treatments. But it seems like clearly since the 1930s, they've been sort of trying to figure out how to, come up with recipes for cosmic rays that they can introduce to create a race of super people. So that's pretty crazy. And then if you think about the controlling influence of a mental guiding field, how does that fit into what we know where things are going with, prescription psychedelics, right? Would that not be a psychokinetic or a controlling mental guiding field? Like, is there some way through, these apps or frequency fields or energy medicine, remote energy medicine, or the psychedelics or something that's going to create this field? So interesting. Yeah. Irradiating then give you a mentally guiding field. And maybe, clearly that's, I think, maybe behind the whole focus on the mental health, right? All the mental health and why they want everybody on apps. This is the point. This is the point our speculations attained until we decided to take it to the next step. The next extension employs the idea that the changes in the spiral arrangements in the cells, the protein chains of the chromosomes, which are responsible for evolutionary changes, are related to field conditions, possibly even to electromagnetic lines of force in our rotating Earth. In that case, there would be some of the synchronism between the macro universe and the micro universe so that each helps determine the other. Accordingly, while the Earth has created man, speaking loosely, man will in turn play upon planetary field conditions and influence the course of evolution because the cell field and the Earth field are in resonance or rapport. Much of the theory, even in its most recent form, is still vague, but one of the persistent ideas is the supposition that with the passage of time, mind or conscious field energy will assume an increasing influence over matter, and that the requirements of the macro universe will coerce the elements responsible for mutation through a psycho or field kinetic effect. That is to say, if and when the Earth's environment is filled with radioactive rays, the human race could concentrate on some collective image or archetype. The field of force thus organized on a macroscopic level might then reach down into the organizing field of the hereditary determiners to fabricate the counterpart of the social image. The reader will have noticed that part of the argument involves an appeal to Dr. J.B. Ryan's controversial PK psychokinetic effect. If mental concentration can somehow influence the statistical distribution of the faces of the dice, why can't mental social concentration, a vast cultural experiment, influence the distribution of the hereditary units to bring into being the appropriate organ for achieving what we have imagined socially as the characteristic of the man to be? And, I think it's important to consider that this man to be is probably like an ant-man, right? Because they actually want us just to go along and be ants for their social computation. Interesting. At this point, it became clear that a fantastic theory had been crystallized, and therefore, to maintain some semblance of contact with reality, I submitted this theory to several scientists to get their comments. First, I sounded out Dr. Ryan, and he replied in part as follows, quote, I hardly know what to make of your treatment. I am increasingly impressed as the necessity of recognizing the mind as determining factor in evolution. Our PK experiments have given more foundation to this hypothesis than any other one item, but there is considerable support from psychosomatic medicine. I wonder that you do not draw upon this material. We are doing some experiments here to extend the PK work into the biological world, but we are not far enough along yet for the conclusions and are saying nothing about them. PK is, of course, an obvious instrument of Lamarckian inheritance. It was to be expected that Dr. Ryan would have had some interest in this line of theorizing, and at the same time, May 1947, I submitted these same ideas to Dr. C.J. Herrick, eminent neurologist, for his comment. And here is the exact language in which the problem was stated. Quote, here is where you can help me. Suppose you were given the power of a creator and decided to confer upon man a new biological structure which will make it possible for man to escape the inner conflict with reason pulling one way and emotion and instinct going the other way. What kind of organ for a new level of synthesis would you endow man with? Where, inside or outside the cerebral spinal axis, would you locate such an organ? If you had to, could you, as a creator, find a way to transcend man's dilemma, revert to primitives, prefrontal lobotomy, or crucify yourself on a cross of conflict because you don't have enough intelligence to recreate civilization so that man won't frustrate his own happiness and destroy mankind? In his reply, Dr. Herrick wrote as follows, your letter reminds me of the Dutch proverb, the sail of theory is too big for the ship of fact. While your theory cannot be ruled out from the possible, I know no evidence that can be adduced in support of it. Your program of directing mutations by radiations under the influence of fields is too far ahead of any validated knowledge. So far as I can see, we shall have to depend for a long time on the old-fashioned way of using such biological and psychological agencies as we already know about. As an exercise in mental gymnastics, your program interests me, but I would not want to sponsor it as scientifically promising. Perhaps you will say the same about my excursions into philosophy in the Coghill book, but we both get a lot of fun out of the exercise. It will be noted that the responses from Drs. Ryan and Herrick treated the problem objectively, without raising the question of whether this experiment would be, quote, a good thing from the ethical standpoint. Before plunging further into the hinterlands of speculation, let us look into the ethics of the program we are here to tentatively trying to formulate. 11, ethical objection to radio eugenics. The next person I consulted was my friend and critic, Blodwin Davies. Her comments show great wisdom, and since the remaining developments in the theory are due in part to the effort to meet her criticisms, it is desirable to reproduce her several responses in her own words. My own reactions are purely personal, but I am definitely repelled by the idea. Your theory is incomplete and premature, and I feel that it is not in line with true evolutionary directions. I feel that we need a lot more fusion of Western thought with the psychological sciences of the East before we are ready to launch into any such plan as you propose. Have you any reason to believe that attacking the chromosomes would produce better types? Have any such experiments with insects improved on the old type? All I have ever heard about are the monstrosities. In one of your chapters in an earlier book, you quote Mary Boole as saying that we feel as our ancestors thought, and so on. This illustrates what I feel about evolution. I would guess that we would have smaller, not larger brains. The complex methods of experimental thinking we do today will be transcended as we become more intuitive. Do you think that an Einstein needs a bigger brain than a waiter? Or is it that they use the same kind of brain differently? Or do the geniuses use some 90% of the normal latent cells? Anyway, true human thinking is not done in the brain, but is registered on the brain. If the experiment worked and you produced bigger brains, you would need a legal right to dispose of the mistakes. Why do we want to create a new species of animal? Are the scientists going off on stunts for their own sake? Or have they good reason for trying to create a new kind of creature? Suppose your experiment, which would involve a number of people, were successful in one sense, and we found ourselves with enough mutated creatures to start a new strain. Might they not have characteristics that would put us old timers at their mercy? Suppose, for instance, a strain was produced that is telepathic. They would then have the means of reading our thoughts at will. There would be nothing secret from them. We are not telepathic now, so we would have no defense against them. Would there be anything to prevent a handful of such people from dominating the world? It would at least be a theme for a thriller. There is no need for you to drop the idea. It may merely be that you have an unfinished experience, an insight that is valid but took form too quickly. If you would like to translate your thoughts into terms of consciousness, you might come very soon on some new method of bridging the gap between tomorrow and today. Much of the argument of my Canadian friend, co-author of our book Planetary Democracy, is based on deep understanding. As a warning, it contains much sound advice. But some comments by way of reply are called for. These will be presented next. Section 12, a reply to criticisms. One might debate some of the technical issues, whether, for example, it is true that a more advanced brain would be smaller because humanity would be more intuitive and therefore free from the contortions of complicated reasoning. One might quote E.D. Adrian, distinguished physiologist at this point, to the effect that modern man does need a larger brain. This could be true even if we used only 10% of our present brain capacity. One might also point, heaven forbid, to new electronic brains, calculating devices which are, quote, better in proportion as they are, quote, bigger. But such considerations are beside the point. We are not asserting that the mutations would produce bigger brains. What we are looking for is some way of transcending the reason versus emotion antithesis in some higher psychic fashion, raising consciousness to a higher level. How this is to be done is a problem in neuropsychology. Perhaps this could be a research problem for a biological division of the National Science Foundation. This would be a Manhattan Project for all of mankind. The major powers of the world have it in their boards of military strategy and planning the next war if and when it comes. So why not have the strategists plan a reconstruction of humanity, which would make war silly and impossible for all time? This would be accomplished by transforming human nature. Another comment on Ms. Davies' critique is that she has concentrated too exclusively on the role of radiation in inducing the mutations and has paid too little attention to the fields, which it was assumed could control the direction of such mutations. My theory, even in its earliest form, was not based on either or premise, either chance mutations by radiation or conscious evolution by mental guiding fields. It was based on both, used simultaneously and in conjunction. It involves the idea that the glands will come into play, one possible medium for the inheritance of acquired traits. Interesting, glands, okay? And that a new energy level will come into being. Such a theory, it seemed to me, came close to what Buck had in mind in his speculations on the role of the emotions or endocrinology in human evolution. Of course, this emphasis was natural at that time in the early stages of my theory as presented to Ms. Davies, because at that time I could give no assurance that the second factor, control by a mental field, would constitute a real factor of safety. Several years later, however, I became much more interested in the work of Carl J. Jung, Swiss psychiatrist, whose theories about archetypes have considerable bearing in these matters. Now, after assimilating some of Jung's theories into my own speculations, this is already evident in previous pages, I am ready to return to the line of theorizing that was put aside several years back. But before returning to the subject of radio eugenics, it is necessary to introduce the material from Jung which we need in the development of our theory. Even before that, however, let us list the problems as they now stand. The full development of the theory of the great experiment calls for elaboration on 3 levels as follows. 1. Psychological level. This is Jung's theory of mental archetypes superimposed on the biological and physical levels of reality and displaying archetypal forms. 2. Biological level. A theory of biological evolution, heredity, and mutation. This could be a theory of the macro world and the micro universe, genes, perhaps in terms of resonance between chromosome fields and the planetary field, now termed radiation belt, with the sun acting as the pacemaker of evolution, as outlined in The Promise of Scientific Humanism. 3. Physical level, a theory of relation between matter and energy, which would, among other things, explain the origin of cosmic rays, yield an adequate meson theory, and quantum mechanical principles. This is a big order. Fortunately, for our present program, it is not necessary here to deal with problems 2 and 3. But a full theory of man, a scientific humanism, will eventually involve a coherent theory on all levels, as indeed we have already shown. Now, however, we concentrate on our psychological problem of how archetypes are established to function and integrative forces on the human social level. Section 13, Jung's theory of archetypes. One of the great merits of Jung's lifelong investigations is the manner in which he makes clear the role of symbols in human functioning. Evolved primarily for purposes of communication and social integration, symbols have become the common denominator of cultural unity and creative art. According to Jung, the primordial image or archetype, for example, the wise old man, the kingdom of heaven, Plato's cave metaphor, is a figure or process that emerges in human consciousness and is so universal that it repeats itself in the course of history, especially where fantasy is present. These mythological forms, the themes of creative art, which depict millions of experiences in the average man, are kind of a psychic residue in man's mental life. Every experience which has dynamic relation to the archetype calls up these nascent images or inborn possibilities of ideas. The source of myth-making or symbolical artwork is not in the personal unconscious of the author, but in that sphere of the racial unconscious, the primordial contents of which are the common heritage of mankind. This is what Jung calls the collective unconscious. Thus, Jung's archetypes arise out of inherited potentiality, mnemonic images expressed in anatomical formations in the very structure of the brain. These are not innate ideas, but inborn possibilities of ideas. In this interesting theory, we have the conception of latent images below the level of individual awareness, developing through inclusions and exclusions of related material from personal experiences until these psychic formations attain a threshold value where they release the energy concerned in symbol-making activity and burst through into consciousness. Here, then, is the secret of effective art. The creative process consists in an animation of the archetypes and the shaping of this image until the work is completed. This shaping of the primordial image is a translation into the language of the present and makes it possible for every man to find again the deepest springs of life. Herein lies the social importance of art. It is consistently at work, educating the spirit of the age by bringing to birth those forms which the age lacks. And I'm just going to say here, I think it's kind of interesting to think about Disney in terms of the whole archetype and the artwork and bringing out these unconscious social realities. The symbol which converts energy is Jung's equivalent of the libido. The rites with which sacred objects are surrounded disclose plainly their character as transformers of energy. According to Jung, Freud's sex symbols are not true symbols, since they have merely the role of signs of background processes. The true symbol is the expression of an intuitive perception, which cannot be expressed differently because there exists as yet no adequate verbal concept. When, for example, Plato expresses the problem of cognition in his metaphor of the cave, or when Christ expresses the idea of the kingdom of heaven through parables, these are genuine symbols. Just as analytical psychology must get rid of the Freudian medical prejudices, so it must transcend the Marxist thesis that myth is primitive man's fumbling attempt at what should be scientifically explained, and therefore will disappear as man gains mastery over nature. When the archetype is stirred, there is the moment of communion, which is felt as something significant, linking us with more universal patterns. As such, At such moments, we are no longer mere individuals, but outlets for those collective representations we call ideals that liberate the soul. The most effective ideals are variations of such archetypes. With Jung's theory of archetypal forms supplying confirmatory evidence for the possibility of establishing collective images in individual consciousness, though Jung offers no explanation for this, we must now return to our own problem. Section 14, archetypes as guiding fields. And I want to just point out here the whole archetype, because I think, again, that's the video games, the avatars, the characters, and the fact that the gamified behavior programs are being implemented in schools. And the characters that are given are not like the Google Classcraft. They are avatar, they are archetypal. So you can't just make up your own character whole cloth. There's like a sample of characters and they're archetypal. So I think that's narrowing human experience to fit into these sections that will be guided by the fields. Our hypothesis is that the concentration on and synthesis of a mental archetype for the new humanity would produce a macroscopic field, which may in turn act on the microfields inside the germ cells. Just as I have heard, the patterns on some varieties of butterfly wings reproduce the patterns of the Earth's electromagnetic fields of force in those regions in which those butterflies are living. So we posit that a globalized pattern of man's ideal image of himself might conspire with man as he is to transfigure human nature. And that reminds me a little bit of the whole cello and the beautiful money, this idea of using an energetic to imprint a certain value. This theory implies a kind of circular reaction arc, a feedback mechanism operating between macro and micro universes. There is some evidence for such reciprocal causation. Thus, for example, an electric current is set through a solution in which a colony of paramecia is living. The paramecia orient or align themselves parallel to the flow of the current and point towards the same pole. On the other hand, as Doctors Burr, Land, and Nims at Yale University have shown, if the living organism salamander is rotated, a field is set up. And here there is a reversible causality similar to that which obtains between the electric and magnetic vectors in a field of force. In an analogous way, we are suggesting that the cell constitutes chromosomes of the nucleus or even constituents in the cytoplasm or both have microfields responsive to macrofield conditions or patterns. And I guess that's sort of getting back to what Michael Levin and the morphogenesis is talking about. This conception implies that if man could precipitate a Platonic archetype for the man to be by a social synthesis of mental fields, perhaps this mental social field could in turn act as a morphogenetic force to coerce the development of the same image in the embryological development of the planetary being. This would be the recapitulation theory in reverse. According to this approach, guiding fields of force are always the integrating factors which maintain the unity of the archetypes on all levels, from the physical through the biological to the psychological. Thus, the archetypal pattern is like a Platonic idea, is the formation field of influence in nature. Since electrical potency is always fundamental in the processes of life, the same sort of polarity on a planetary level must be provided if our experiment is to succeed. Moreover, if this polarity involved the cooperation of 2 billion human beings, it must focus on a social symbol image, which has the power to concentrate and intensify human energy. For this is our equivalent of the repetition of images in Jung's system. This symbol will involve the transmutation of individual experiences through a creative idea which possesses strong integrative action. Suppose, therefore, man has reached the place in Earth history where he is prepared to take his evolution into his own hands. He has decided on an experiment in mental social vision to guide the genetic changes, microevolution, in conformity with the psychosocial image, macroevolution. What should be the picture man should frame of himself if he is to be his own creator? Would the addition of another supragranular layer to the cortex be the mutation required to produce a higher psychic synthesis? Or is there some other way to get to the thalamic areas and the prefrontal lobes into some super integration? I cannot answer these questions. Perhaps, as previously suggested, this should be left to our engineers working in an institute of scientific humanism. But even though we do not know the modus operandi whereby results would be achieved, there may still be reasonable hope that nature would find a way. And I am thinking here of a similar situation in the individual organism in a discussion of the implications of psychosomatic medicine by Dr. G. Evelyn Hutchinson, American Scientist, 1947, volume 36, page 155. Reference is made to the remarkable experiments in which blisters are raised at designated spots as the result of commands to a person under hypnosis. As Dr. Hutchinson puts it, the question that arises is how, in the view of the general difficulty of learning any unfamiliar bodily operation, does the subject know how to raise a blister at the spot designated by the hypnotist? Such an experiment seems, in fact, to imply some sort of unconscious, intuitive, physiological knowledge. It must be difficult to define such a concept in strictly operational form, but a rather detailed investigation of the situation in epistemological terms would seem desirable, because it is hard to avoid the conclusion that the ordinary practical concept of knowing how to do a thing is not really applicable, while it is even more unlikely that any kind of innate response can be involved. Of course, the moral of the story is this: if there is a kind of wisdom of the body by means of which intuitive physiological knowledge operates, may this not also be the case in the relation between a world brain, socially visualized and held in consciousness, and the body's neuroblasts of the human beings, which function as the embryonic cells of the emerging planetary organism? This, then, is the tentative form of our hypothesis as thus far formulated. Before leaving this baffling realm of mental visions, let us once more return to the ethical problem, which is bound to bulk large in the thinking of many persons. Back to ethics, section 15. The ethical argument that such an experiment, even if it were technically feasible, should ever be undertaken because the use of atomic energy radiation is too dangerous, the mutants produced being lethal or retrogressive in the long run, certainly needs to be seriously considered. But as part of the rebuttal, one might submit the following propositions. 1. If we are to have another war anyway, atomic bombs of the hydrogen and plutonium variety are likely to be employed, and the resulting radioactivity will be doing its work regardless of ethics. And 2, the only way to prevent such a war is to undertake a planetary experiment so vast and so magnificent that the intense cooperation of all humanity is required. If, however, we can secure international control of atomic weapons, I agree that we should not use atomic energy, radioactivity, to initiate mutations, but only to try the experiment as an exercise in the conscious control of human evolution through psychobiological guiding fields. And I think this is a lot of the mindfulness stuff, right? This is no mere academic discussion. As civilization is now proceeding, it is becoming clear that more and more people are breaking down, and this will continue unless A, we simplify our environment by evolving a meaningful and stable culture fostering integration within the individual, or B, we evolve a human type capable of coping with increasingly complex and unintegrated culture. But if we get B, we will automatically get A, and we can't get A except by way of B. And this dilemma is analogous to the old problem: can a man lift himself by his own bootstraps? The reply on the level of the psychological problem is that if he doesn't lift himself, man is going to sink back into the mud of the ancient seas from which life first took its origin. We have here a genuine either or, either mass creativity or mass destruction. Which is it to be? And that is the end of that. Like, that's just the last chapter. Seriously, I only got to 85 and then I had to get up because it was a lot of really complex physics. But thanks for sticking with me. I think this is really important to sort of have his premise of radio eugenics, and then also thinking through, I need to get back to Julius Stolman and the Foundation for Integrated Education, but Stolman's magazine was called Fields Within Fields Within Fields. And so that's, I think, the field interactivity that he's talking about there is the mental field guidance system. So, I feel likely that what is coming is a future that's going to be proposed where they're going to take the old nuclear offline because they're aging out, and people, there will be all of this hue and cry against the assertions of green energy, and then they'll come back and they'll say, oh yes, you're right, we need nuclear power to meet our net zero goals, but we'll use this new modular nuclear, and then they'll fast track that because all the billionaires are backing the modular nuclear. And you can see there's a little clip that I put up earlier today from the Mormon Transhumanist Conference, the guy from Brigham Young University who's developing these modular nuclear reactors. And then the side benefit, quote unquote, is that there's all of these radioactive isotopes, which I think will be in line with the radio eugenics program. And then the goal will be to have these decentralized grid systems on blockchain, and probably to have some sort of energy economy like linked all into that. And so, and it's hard to see, how to stop this, because for the most part, people are still caught up in a lot of different stories that don't involve emergence or systems theory or cybernetics or distributed governance or thermoeconomics or any of these things. Like, they don't even know these are things that they're supposed to be paying attention to. They're literally just saying like, oh, there's a Gaia worshiping death cult in charge of the world. And, and they're just lost. They don't have any of the deeper understandings. And so until you can get people to say like, okay, maybe at some point, the modular nuclear, if they can prove that it's safe, I'm not wholesale against it, but we have to talk about what it means to be part of a distributed energy grid, with RFK Jr. candidate talking about every person being their own energy entrepreneur, and what that looks like, and how it's all integrated with our biology and the Internet of Bio-Nano things. Because clearly, even within this, like the telepathy that they're talking about, the psychic connection, it's like our boundaries between our body and the rest of the world, they're going to be a lot more porous. Like I think they feel like we're really not going to have bodily autonomy anymore, because our psychic stuff will just all be leaking out everywhere. So anyway, thanks for listening. I think maybe it was a little bit boring, but at least we have it sort of documented. If someone wants to go back and wonder, like, what did Oliver Reiser actually say about radio eugenics? We've got it locked in now. All right. Bye, guys.